This is TWiT.
It is possible to have a backdoor, and it is possible to have a backdoor that's secure, but the only way that works is if you make sure that that key never, ever leaks. And we already have a very good example of a federal agency allowing that to happen. That's the TSA that made the master keys, the special keys that unlock TSA-approved locks. And someone had the bright idea to take a picture of it and put it into an article. Well, now anyone who has that picture can print themselves out a set of keys that unlock the luggage at airports. This is the same sort of thing. You have to assume it's going to leak. And if that leaks, it means you've basically just broken encryption for everybody. I mean, is there a feasible way to have a key and not have it leak and only be used exactly when it's supposed to be used?
No, not really. Now, I will go back and hit the Wayback Machine back about 35 years now. I was privy to a coffee room conversation about this brand new thing called SSL. And I was actually at the headquarters for the U.S. Postal Service. And I was saying, why don't you guys, as the Postal Service, start going electronic? Why don't you be the key authority? And if you make it inexpensive enough, then suddenly, all these, little people making this thing called a key authority might not survive, and you guys would be the key authority, at least for America. That conversation got a lot of people going, but it was, it'll never work. It's not enough business. Postal Service could never do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Curtis, I want to bring something else up here, and that is we often talk about the law of unintended consequences, and that's the fact that when you make a law, it could be completely out of good intentions. It could have a defined purpose, and yet somehow it will always have unintended consequences, and most of the time those unintended consequences are horrible. Really good example. There's a law in China right now that was passed that if you strike a pedestrian, if you strike somebody, you are responsible for their care for the rest of their lives. That's just how it works. It makes sense. If you maim someone, if you disable someone, you are now responsible for them. However, it led to a rash of people striking pedestrians and then backing up and hitting them again to make sure that they killed them. Because if you kill them, you pay out a huge sum once, not for the rest of your life. Law of unintended consequences. When we look at that sort of law of unintended consequences here, when we are looking at something like how well the Clipper chip had worked or the previous attempts to enforce some sort of security backdoor, I'm really wondering about the international ramifications. And this is not just for security. This is for several different issues that have really been looking at what kind of pressure a U.S. agency can put on an international multinational company. If you have a U.S. law enforcement agency saying you must, if you want to sell products in this country, include some sort of backdoor that we have access to, doesn't that also set the precedent for every other country and every other law enforcement agency, every other intelligence service saying, well, you need to do the same thing here. You want to sell phones in Russia? We need a key. You want to sell phones in China? We need a key. You want to sell phones in Iran? We need a key. Isn't this just sort of saying, okay, nothing is secure?
Oh, it is. It is. And I think that's an important note. And I also think that weakening the encryption in this way could do something really fun, like run headlong into European privacy laws, the GDPR that we've talked about here on TWiT. As Brian says, if humans were never involved, it might be easier, although we've seen many times where human bias is programmed into machine learning and artificial intelligence as well. I think that for the kind of unintended consequences we've talked about, we really have to look no further than in the U.S., the resource officer program in our public schools. After 9/11, when we were, with great justification, quite worried about terrorist activity, huge sums of money were given to communities to put resource officers, typically police officers or sheriff's deputies, into public schools. I've known many of these resource officers, fine people, but if you look, the case in Florida down at Stoneman Douglas High School shows that they've been very little use against mass shootings and terrorist activities. But what we have seen is a huge jump in the number of what used to be considered childish fist fights or wrestling matches that suddenly became felonies because a police officer was involved. The consequences of that decision have been entirely different than what were intended, and I think it's highly likely that the same would be true if we started walking down this particular unencryption path.
Indeed. Gilbert, I want to give you the last word on this because you had some particularly strong emotions around when we'll stop hearing about this.
Yeah. One, we're not going to stop hearing about it until quantum computing actually becomes real. It's a big enough issue that Mo doesn't really want to talk about it because it's going down a rabbit hole, and it's a very deep rabbit hole. But quantum computing has the potential, we don't know for sure, but it has the potential of actually making all encryption worthless. Right. Or very much. That could stop this conversation dead in its tracks very quickly.
Of course, then you just have the FBI saying, now we're in a really dark zone.